I think Bitcoin should be worth at least $1.2 million today. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you what exactly I mean by this. Let's get started. Not everybody knows this, but there are so many different institutions involved in every single payment that you make. So when you try to pay a merchant, you have to go through a service provider, an acquirer, a card, and an issuing bank. So the card brands are something like MasterCard, Visa, American Express. The issuing banks are the banks that we use on a daily basis. Issuing banks are banks like RBC, Citibank, Chase, TD, Wells Fargo, BMO. We have acquirers like Moneris, Chase. We have service providers like Clearly Payments, Square, Stripe. This isn't even all of the institutions that are involved. There are other institutions involved along the way. And I was looking at some numbers for how much the financial services industry is worth. So we can see here, keep in mind that this is from Google's AI. Could be wrong. I've seen these numbers before, though. It seems like it's pulling from Finance Canada, Investopedia, and a report from some blog, I guess. But I've seen these numbers before. It says here, the financial services industry is estimated to be around 20 to 25% of the world economy. The size of the financial industry is difficult to measure, but can be estimated using metrics like market capitalization, assets under management, or market size. So we can see here, global financial services. In 2022, the global financial services market was valued at about $25.5 trillion. The financial services market is expected to grow to $58.69 trillion by 2031. So a lot of this is probably going to be a result of inflation. A lot of this is going to be a result of governments printing a lot more money and really pumping up these institutions. And the next point here, the growth of the financial services market is driven by the digitalization of banks and the expansion of commercial lending. So what banks are doing is basically they're turning your money digital so that they can create more of it whenever they want to. And then they're expanding commercial lending. And we can see here the size of the global economy is $110 trillion. So if we take 25% of this, of course, and we attribute it to the Bitcoin network, we get about $27 trillion for the Bitcoin network alone. So just based on that, if we divide $27 trillion by the number of coins that are out there, so 21 million coins, we get about $1.28 million. But I actually think that Bitcoin should be worth more than this because Bitcoin eliminates all of the redundancies that we have in the current financial system. We have tons of resources going towards things that we don't need. We have tons of resources going towards banking institutions. We have a lot of buildings going towards these banks. Think about how many of these banks have massive buildings in the downtown, the best real estate. They're taking over the best real estate because we need them as a service provider to help us to solve the functions of money. And what exactly are the functions of money? I wrote a tweet here explaining what exactly we need banks for. So these functions are storing value, accounting for value, and transferring value. So number one, if you want to transfer value to your future self, you're going to use a bank, a financial institution, to store that value for you. We rely on banks because we can't create our own money. The money that we have has to be created by banks. It has to be approved by the US government. The Federal Reserve is involved. So in order to store value, we need banks. We can't create our own banks. We can't have a bank at our own house until Bitcoin existed. We also use financial institutions to transfer value. And the reason for this is that it's impossible to transfer value across the world unless you have an intermediary. Today, we use digital money, and anything that's digital can be replicated. And we use banks as that intermediary to confirm that the money that we're sending and receiving is actually real. And they've, of course, taken advantage of this. They create as much money as they possibly can. Like I said, they've been expanding their commercial lending businesses. So they're creating more and more money out of thin air in order to let people buy the things that they can't afford so that banks can take an even bigger cut out of the economy. So what banks do is they create money out of thin air, then they charge you interest for lending you that money, even though they've created it out of nothing. So what Bitcoin does is it fulfills all of these functions of money, and we don't need financial institutions to use it. We can use Bitcoin for all of these functions. We don't need the dollar. In order for you to store the dollar, you are required to have a bank account unless you hold cash. Even that cash could rot. It could rip, it could burn. If your house goes on fire, for example, you've lost all of your savings. So we require banks for all of these functions. Today, you don't need banks anymore because of the Bitcoin network. So the Bitcoin network can allow you to store value because the Bitcoin network issues these tokens or these coins called BTC or Bitcoin. These coins have a limited supply. Nobody can create more of them. Nobody can manipulate the supply. We can use Bitcoin to account for value because we can price things in Bitcoin. So let's say, for example, if you wanted to buy this thumbtack from me, maybe it'll cost you 1,000 Satoshis or 10 Satoshis, whatever the number is. We can use Bitcoin to account for value because we can price things in Bitcoin. We can price things in Satoshis. Bitcoin also allows us to transfer value. You can send value anywhere in the world using the Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin network is separate from Bitcoin, the coin. The Bitcoin network is simply a network of computers. They're called nodes, reachable Bitcoin nodes. There are 21,225 reachable Bitcoin nodes, and there are something like 100,000 Bitcoin nodes that can't be reached. So these nodes, these computers, are all around the world, and they're enforcing the Bitcoin protocol. We can see here the Bitcoin protocol. So the Bitcoin protocol is the set of rules that govern the functioning of Bitcoin. Its key components and principles are a peer-to-peer decentralized network with no central oversight. That's the key. The blockchain technology, a public ledger that records all Bitcoin transactions, mining and proof of work, the process to create new Bitcoins and verify transactions, and cryptographic security. So what these computers are doing, all of these computers, they're the Bitcoin network. They are enforcing the Bitcoin protocol. Without these computers, we'd have to rely on financial institutions. We'd have to rely on massive institutions that are, of course, centralized. And of course, they have their own motives. The best thing about the Bitcoin network is that anyone in the world can run one of these computers, these nodes that enforce the Bitcoin protocol. On the other hand, in the current financial system, we have only large financial institutions that can run nodes. They are the only ones that can audit transactions. They're the only ones that can confirm or deny transactions. And of course, these institutions are controlled by governments. On the Bitcoin network, you can rely on yourself to run a node and basically run your own bank. If you run a node and you want to receive Bitcoin, you can confirm that the transaction was received on your own. You don't have to rely on anybody else's node to confirm that transaction for you. On the other hand, in the current financial system, you have to rely on financial institutions to store value. So for example, today, you can't digitally store dollars without relying on financial institutions. You can't digitally store stocks or bonds without relying on financial institutions. So today, the financial systems protocol is enforced by these computers that are easily able to be taken over by governments. They can be coerced. They can be used against us. For example, let's say you have a bank account with one of the banks that I mentioned before. Your government says that you haven't paid your taxes, so now you don't deserve to have any of your money. What they can do is they can reach out to the banks and they can say that this person's bank account should no longer be accessible by them. So what they can do is they can freeze your accounts, they can stop you from using your money, they can stop you from transacting, they can stop you from fulfilling all of the functions of money that you need on a day-to-day basis. So let's say they stop letting you store value using a bank account. You no longer have value for your future self. You can no longer transfer value to your future self. Of course, you can hold physical dollars, but the thing is that these physical dollars are pieces of paper. More of them can be created at will. So what that means is that your value is constantly being stolen from you. So because dollars don't work as a store of value, we rely on banks and financial institutions to offer us stocks, bonds, real estate. We rely on them to let us borrow money that they create out of thin air in order for us to buy real assets, real goods in the economy. Again, the issue here is that our ability to store value can be stolen. Our ability to store value relies on financial institutions. If the financial institutions that we have to use on a day-to-day basis don't like us, well, they can kick us off the network. They can get rid of us. They can stop us from being able to store value using their network. The next one, accounting for value. If you don't have access to a bank account, if you don't have access to credit cards, if you don't have access to a means of transferring value, how are you going to account for value? We rely on financial institutions for all of these services. And what Bitcoin does is it allows us to not rely on financial institutions. So, like I said, the Bitcoin network or all of these computers are the ones that are enforcing the Bitcoin protocol. They're the ones that are confirming and making sure that the Bitcoin protocol follows the rules that it's supposed to. If anyone tries to transact on the Bitcoin network without following the rules, all of these computers will reject their transaction. So let's say, for example, if somebody has a transaction that they want to put through, let's say they want to send one Bitcoin to someone else and they don't have one Bitcoin, they're not going to be able to process that transaction. That transaction is going to be rejected because if their address doesn't contain one Bitcoin, they don't have one Bitcoin to send. On the other hand, in the current financial system, if you don't have $100,000, banks will create new dollars out of thin air and they'll pass them on to the next person so that you can buy whatever you want to and the other person can get their dollars, even though you don't actually have dollars, even though you don't have the money to fund your purchase of whatever you want to buy. And the reason why I don't like this financial system, the reason why I think it's so corrupt, is because it favors the wealthy over the poor. If you have a job where you're making $200,000 a year, you're going to be able to use that job, that income, as collateral essentially to borrow money and to buy whatever you want to. Let's say you have a $200,000 job, your bank will give you a $800,000 loan. So you can bring your future consumption to the present. And that's what breaks everything. It just completely destroys the concept of time value of money. It makes it so that people don't value money right now and they start spending more than they have. They go into debt because they know that other people can borrow money that's created out of thin air and they can use that money to buy whatever they want to, meaning the price of everything goes up. So in this economy, the one that I call the legacy financial system with all these banks and financial institutions and payment processors, savers get screwed over because more money can be created out of thin air. So if you save dollars, eventually the value of those dollars is going to be extracted, it's going to be taken away from you, and it's going to be given to all of these financial institutions. It's going to be given to, let's say, politicians to pay for their salaries because your government is going to create more money out of thin air. If we take a look at the US debt clock, we can see here that the US national debt is $36.3 trillion. Not too long ago, it was 35 trillion, it was 30 trillion, it was 15 trillion. This number has gone up so quickly because the value of our money keeps decreasing over time, and more money is required to pay for the largest budget items of the US government. So the US government is paying for Medicare, Medicaid, it's paying for Social Security, it's paying for defense and war, it's paying for the interest on this debt. The interest alone is $1 trillion a year. So what the US government is doing is it's earning $4.986 trillion a year in tax revenues, and it's spending almost $7 trillion. And the only reason for this, of course, is because money can be created out of nothing. If we couldn't create money out of nothing, the US government wouldn't be able to run on a deficit and it wouldn't be spending $2 trillion more than it earns every single year. So back to these nodes, what these nodes do is they stop anybody from overspending. If you don't have Bitcoin, you can't spend. So let's say, for example, you want a mansion, you don't have 20 Bitcoin to buy it, then you can't have that mansion. It's as simple as that. On the other hand, in the current financial system, the banking system allows people to spend money they don't have in order to buy things they can't afford. And now let's go back to the topic of this video. One Bitcoin is worth at least $1.2 million. The Bitcoin network can completely replace the entire current financial system that we rely on. It can be used to account for value, to store value, and to exchange value with other people. Keep in mind that, of course, I haven't considered all of the redundancies that I mentioned before of the current financial system. Think about all of the resources that are being wasted on the current financial system. There's labor, there's capital, there's land, there's buildings. All of this is a waste of our resources. All of this is stopping us from advancing as a society. All of it is stopping more people from prospering in their day-to-day lives. One of the greatest things about the Bitcoin network is that anyone can access it. Anyone can use it to account for value, to store value, and to exchange value. We can see here, this website is called mempool.space. We can see every single transaction that's ever happened. If we go all the way back to block number 1, we can see this was the first block that was created with Bitcoin that's usable. We can actually see where every single Bitcoin went. We can see when it was created. We know for a fact that none of the Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network is created out of nothing. We know for a fact that all of the Bitcoin that was created was issued in exchange for an appropriate amount of work. This is where proof of work comes in. In the current financial system, there's no proof of work involved. Whenever somebody receives Bitcoin, let's say, for example, on this block, we know for a fact that they put in the appropriate amount of energy required in order to mine that block. In order to mine a block, you need to contribute a certain amount of resources to the Bitcoin network. So, for example, you have to contribute your time, your energy, your resources, your knowledge, all of that to the Bitcoin network, your hardware, all of that has to be contributed to the Bitcoin network. And if you don't have any of that, you can't create a block. Creating a block is the process of mining. So when you mine for Bitcoin, what you're doing is you're competing with other people on the Bitcoin network to create the next block on the Bitcoin network, on the Bitcoin blockchain. Anyone in the world can mine for Bitcoin as long as they put in the time, energy, resources required in order to find the next block. We can see here that the amount of energy, time, and resources being contributed to the Bitcoin network keep increasing and keep increasing. And this number is growing exponentially. We can see here that these numbers back here, they may have seemed like they were big or small back then, but today they're irrelevant. This number back here may have seemed massive on January 24th, 2015. It was 277 petahash per second, but today it's a rounding error. Today we have 829 exahashes per second being contributed to the Bitcoin network. So the amount of energy, resources, and time being allocated to the Bitcoin network continues to rise. And now I just want to explain proof of work to you and why the current financial system is completely broken. So proof of work is a blockchain consensus mechanism in which computing power is used to verify cryptocurrency transactions and add them to the blockchain. So a bunch of computers are basically contributing all of their resources, their computing power to the Bitcoin network, and we're using those computers in order to verify every single transaction that happens, every single transaction that goes through. The biggest problem with the current financial system is that there is no proof of work required. Anybody can borrow money and they can have it created out of thin air. So for example, if you were to go to a bank and you were to get a credit card, they can lend you money without you having to do any work to actually get that money. So in the current financial system, there's less of an incentive to work and to produce value. And instead, there's more of an incentive to just create more money out of thin air and continue to consume. The reason why the current financial system is broken is because there is no proof of work required. Banks can create money out of thin air and they can hand it over to you. Now you can go and spend it at any merchant and you can get whatever you want to, and you don't have to do any real work to get that money. Banks can create this money that we use today out of nothing. On the other hand, with Bitcoin, that's not possible. And if we go back to the reachable nodes, all of these computers are ensuring that miners, the ones that actually create the blocks, are using the appropriate amount of energy in order to create the next block. For example, if we take a look at this block here, whoever created this block, F2 pool, it was a pool, they received 3.218 Bitcoin for their contributions to the network. They received in total 0.093 Bitcoin in fees and 3.125 Bitcoin as a block subsidy. So the block subsidy is the minimum amount of Bitcoin that you'll receive for mining Bitcoin. Anyone in the world can mine for Bitcoin. The transaction fees are paid based on how quickly somebody wants to have their transaction confirmed and added to the next block. If you want to have your transaction confirmed and added to the very next block, you have to pay a transaction fee because everything in Bitcoin is based on supply and demand. Everything in Bitcoin is based on market dynamics. So for example, right now there are 181,486 transactions that are unconfirmed. each of these blocks has a limit for the amount of transactions that can be included in it. So we can see here, 181,000 transactions. In total, the last block has only 2,047 transactions. So whoever wants to have their transaction confirmed or settled or added to the next block can pay a transaction fee as an incentive for the miner who creates the next block in order to have them include their transaction in that block. The Bitcoin network and Bitcoin, the asset, are two completely separate things, but both of them work together. And if you combine them, if you really understand how they work, you know for a fact that they can compete with all of the financial institutions that we have today. I think Bitcoin will take over the financial services industry. I think Bitcoin is worth a minimum of $1.28 million. I think over time, this number is going to keep increasing and keep increasing until everybody on Earth has Bitcoin. And that will be the real value of Bitcoin. At that point, we're going to value Bitcoin at 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin. Today, the entire world is forced to use the current financial system. So we have to value things in dollars, in yen, in won, whatever currency we use on a daily basis. If we take a look at Bitcoin's returns versus traditional assets like gold and the S&P 500, of course, Bitcoin has outperformed them massively. If we take a look at the compound annual growth rate, again, we can see that Bitcoin has outperformed everything. It's outperforming everything forever until Bitcoin is the only form of money that we use on a daily basis. Today, Bitcoin is considered just a store of value. Most people don't use it as a medium of exchange or a unit of account. Eventually, Bitcoin will be the medium of exchange and unit of account that everybody in the world uses. And we're not going to use fiat currencies anymore. At that point, you're not going to be able to buy Bitcoin using pieces of paper. You're going to be working for it. You're going to be exchanging goods and services for it. And that's where I come to my conclusion here. Bitcoin is a much better alternative to the current financial system. Bitcoin should be valued at least 25% of the global economy that we have today. So if things work out the way that I think they will, Bitcoin is going to absorb the entire global financial system worth 25, 26, 27 trillion dollars today, and one Bitcoin is going to be worth $1,285,714.